And welcome back to Sullivan's Unheard Voices. We met at the State Fair.
Mhm.
And when you told me what you did as like an independent publisher, it piqued my interest. And the reason it piqued my interest is because you don't hear about that too often, about people who are independently getting into the publishing business. But yet, on my podcast, I love to talk to people that are doing things like that because it's the small independent publishers that provide, I think, the best material. How did you get started?
Well, I guess I definitely never intended to go into publishing.
Yeah.
I have always been a writer. Um, I started writing when I was 4, and a friend won this hideous, like plush, doll from one
Yeah.
of those claw machines.
Yeah.
And she's like, I don't want this. I'll give it to Katie. And, as you do.
Yeah.
And so I, my mom saw that and was like, do you actually want this? And for just a moment, I, in my head, was responding like any other kid would, which is like, why would I want this?
Yeah.
And then I had a moment of brilliance when I realized, wait, this could be the sympathetic villain of a superhero series. And so that's how I started writing. I don't still have the books, unfortunately,
Oh, that's a bummer.
but I do still have the doll.
Okay.
Yeah.
Uh-huh. So you saw this doll and you thought of a super villain?
A sympathetic villain.
Sympathetic villain.
Yeah. So there was a different.
What's the difference between a super villain and a sympathetic villain?
Sure. Well, a sympathetic villain, and apparently I knew this when I was 4, I don't know, but a sympathetic villain is when you have a person who should have been going down a path to, I don't know, be a good guy, I guess.
Yeah.
Just a path like you or I, except when life hit, they made a series of bad choices and became a villain instead of staying the hero. And the crazy thing with villain origin stories is that a hero and a villain can quite literally have the same origin story. It ultimately boils down to what choices they end up making through the events they face.
And really, if you put it into perspective, you're only one decision away from turning into a villain, basically, or a hero.
Yeah, I mean, it's kind of a series of small things,
Yeah.
but yeah. So there was a supervillain in that story, which was Evil Eddie, and he's the one who corrupted this girl. But
And how many pages was the first book when you wrote when you were 4?
I don't remember. I would fill up those just regular spiral notebooks.
That's so awesome.
And I couldn't write very much at the time, but I would draw pictures. And of course, I had no idea of copyright. So you'd have cameo appearances from Star Wars characters or Care Bears or whatever else. But
that's so awesome. And I'm so jealous because, like, as somebody who's autistic, I don't have an active imagination. So I would never be able to, like, put a book together, especially even a fiction. So just from out the gate, that's just amazing. And you never stopped after 4. You just kind of kept going. How many books do you have out right now?
Well, as far as published, well, I guess that kind of depends on how you define that, because technically I did publish 2 books in high school, which were short stories. That was more for practice than anything else. And then I did publish on Kindle 1 short story in college, I think. But as far as through my publishing company now, I have 2 of my own books out, and I have 3 of other people who are so awesome. Involved in our company, I guess.
And so how do you start that process, right? So, like, how do you come up with, like, the storyboard or the story behind it? Like, what's the creative I've always wanted to know how writers come up with their material. Because it's just, everybody has a different story and a different way, and there's no wrong way, and everyone is an amazing story, I think.
Yeah, so you're asking, how do you basically come up with an idea and then actually put the story together? Yeah. Okay. For me, usually, I don't know, I'll get some random idea, which I may or may not do anything with, right?
Okay. Yeah.
I get a lot more ideas than I actually write, let's say. And especially when I was around 11ish, I would have a new idea every week. And so I had a lot of books that were, I wrote one chapter and then nothing else ever happened with it. But as far as with the stories that you actually stick with, I don't know, I guess some random thing inspires you. And it could be a feeling, it could be, oh, when I was younger, there were a lot of stories that came from games I was playing with friends.
Okay.
Like I had one that I wrote when I was 11 or 12 that had to do with people who were getting abducted to this space station on the moon via these weird purple blobs that would come down and suck you up when the moon was shaped like a crescent tooth. And so,
awesome.
It was a game that I played with a friend. I decided it was cool. I decided to write a book about it. You're not going to be able to buy that on Amazon because I never edited it. I
Right.
never edited it and published it. Um, but yeah, now I guess, ah, yeah, I guess for me, the hard part isn't coming up with the ideas. The hard part is actually making the finished product.
Okay.
If that makes sense.
Yeah.
So, because I tend to, so whenever I write a first draft,
Yeah.
I just kind of sit down and just BS it and, just see what happens,
Yeah.
right? I'll have some vague idea of where the story's going, and the rest is just kind of, who knows, right? And then as I rewrite, which I usually rewrite many, many times, then I will stop. I'll have the completed draft, and I'll pretty much throw it all away. I don't actually delete it, but I make a new document. But before I write anything new on my new document, I will take tons and tons of sticky notes usually.
Yeah.
And I will just write, and I'll put things in chronological order. So day 1, day 2, day 3, etc. And so I'll just write down one sentence descriptions of scenes that need to happen. Oh, and Lene's going to need to talk to so and so about this thing, right?
Yeah.
And so I'll write that on a sticky note, set it on the ground somewhere, and just do that with scene after scene after scene. And then I'll kind of arrange them visually and eventually start figuring out, all right, how many things are happening in one day? This thing happens first, this thing happens first. And so when I rewrite, I'll take all those sticky notes, I'll put them into a OneNote document, and because that way I can access my list from any device.
Yeah.
And if I'm going to sit down and write, I look at what is the one sentence prompt for this scene, and I'll kind of think about it and whatnot. And then once again, I just kind of sit down and see what happens with it.
That's so awesome.
So it's like, I guess in that sense, people usually, they break it down into the idea of, are you a planner or a pantser?
Yeah.
So pantser being I just kind of sat down and see what
See
flew
what
out of
comes
my
out.
fingers.
Yeah.
And so I'm very much both, because when I'm generating, then I'm pantsing. And then when I'm making sure that this needs to all actually make sense, then I'm planning in a lot of detail.
That's awesome. So it sounds to me that's very similar to what I hear painters go through.
Okay.
Where they put in the basics and the foundational piece, and then they take a step back and they organize their thoughts and then fill in the details as needed. That's fascinating. And then as you're storyboarding and you're putting in all of these details, has there ever been a time where you're like thought of a new ending and you like go in a different direction completely?
Oh, well, sure. And the problematic thing is when you do something like you're working on book 2 or book 3, and you realize, oh, wait, this would be way better if this thing happened. Then you realize you have to change book 1 because where book 1 was leading to is no longer happening. So that has definitely gotten me stumped a lot of times. And in fact, when I originally got ready to publish book 1, Gap in the Road, I had book 2 almost ready to go. So I figured, oh yeah, no, there'll just be a good 1-year gap in between publishing book 1 and book 2. Awesome. Well, then I changed some things in book 3, which meant then I had to change things in book 1 or book 2. So now I'm completely rewriting book 2, and I don't yet know when that's going to come out because I'm still only about a half to 2/3 of the way done rewriting it right now.
And you don't know it's complete until it tells you it's complete. Right?
I mean, so for me, I'm never going to be 100% satisfied with the story.
Fair. Yeah, that's fair.
With book 1, I had to eventually get to the place where I'm like, this is good enough. And I'm just going to publish it because once it's out, I can't touch it anymore.
Yeah.
For better, for worse, it's done. And there are and I've had mixed feelings with this because there are things I can look back and say, oh, this could have been so much better. And yet there's kind of a redemptive side of seeing the growth that has to happen through the characters.
Yeah.
In how it is right now, if that makes sense. One of the things that I think is really interesting about, let's say, the main character of the series is a lot of the character flaws that she has are character flaws that I have historically had.
Interesting.
And further, like, things that I didn't even realize were flaws, I thought were strengths. And so now...
So does that make you have to, like, take a walk back and, like, evaluate yourself?
Oh, sure, yeah.
Wow, that must have been a wild experience.
Yeah, and I mean, I'm already a ridiculously introspective person anyway.
Yeah.
But it means that, yeah, there's a certain surreal element to as I'm rewriting book 2 or book 3, and the kinds of ways that she's having to grow are ways that I've had to grow. And so it ends up working out, you know?
Yeah. That's awesome. Oh, and so, like, when you get to, like, book 1 and it's done, and now with book 2, you said you wait about a year. Is there, like, a general rule of thumb in publishing, like, time you're supposed to be between?
Well, I mean, so ideally, you'd space the books out long enough that, you know, people are waiting anxiously for it, but not too long that they forget about it. The problem is it has definitely been more than a year by now, because I think I published Gap in the Road in, I think it was December of 22.
Okay.
So again, it's been more than a year because I ended up realizing I needed to rewrite book 2, which was not originally the plan.
Yeah.
But I mean, it's a much better book because of it. So.
And as the character grows, the book grows, and yeah.
Mm-hmm.
Interesting. And so what prompted you to make that decision to go from just a writer to stepping in or dipping your toe into the publishing business?
Yeah. Well, a couple different things. One, I've always been a ridiculous person. And
okay.
I can't not dream big, I guess.
Oh, I love that.
The only thing is, usually I come up with a crazy idea and I say, oh yes, I should do that. And then reality hits and or I get scared. And so I don't actually do the thing, right?
Story of my life.
Yeah.
Yep.
Mm-hmm. And that probably should have, and that would have been what happened with the publishing company too. But there were a couple problems. One, I happened to get inspired by a book I had just read that, was basically, it's a lovely book called Adorning the Dark, which was all, about this guy who kind of just fumbled through making, just his life as an artist and a Christian and, just, I don't even know how to do this artist thing, right?
Yeah.
And through his various mistakes, ended up making a meaningful community down in his side of the country where he's part of, right? And that really inspired me because there were a lot of things about his life that I related to. I related to the not feeling like I knew what I was doing. I related to the the I don't know, just that artistic drive, I guess. I don't know.
Yeah.
And the dreaming big but always feeling unsure of yourself kind of thing. And just seeing like, wow, this nobody's been able to make a big difference where he is. What if I was able to do the same thing in my area of the country, that kind of thing. And so and then the other problem was I had recently gotten married at this point, and I have a husband who believes in what I'm doing.
That's awesome. That's awesome.
So when I would want to chicken out, he'd be encouraging me forward. And so that's kind of how it started. Well, and then one other thing also kind of contributed to it as well, where 2020 had hit, and I had started an online writers community just with some friends of mine from college.
Yeah.
Which I had started in college. I had run a writing club. We were the Dead Writers Society.
Oh, I love that. I love that. Okay.
Yeah.
Yep. Uh-huh.
And and we had a good time. I mean, it was a super casual kind of a thing. But in 2020, when my friends and I were all bored, and so we started this writers community, and we called it Alonili Council, which Alonili is the kind of the kingdom, the non-traditional kingdom that where a lot of my story takes place.
Oh, nice.
And so we started that, and we were reading each other's stuff, and that ended up kind of morphing into what eventually became Alonili Press. A lot of those people who I started out with, have since moved on and gone and done their own things. But some of them have stayed. The ones who, and I think that's how any venture like this starts. You have people who come in and are enthusiastic because they're your friend, but then you have other people who stick around because they're actually passionate about what you're creating.
Yeah.
And so, now we have a council of 8 authors who are really passionate about this company.
That's
awesome. Basically, once we get a couple more authors, we'll eventually have to split into 2 councils.
But growth is never a bad thing.
No. Well, and what's really cool about basically what makes this model both weird and also, I don't know, promising.
Yeah.
Is that most publishing. So here's also. So I guess let me backtrack just a little bit. Part of why I started this also was because the publishing industry is just inherently flawed.
Oh, that's an understatement.
Yeah.
Yeah.
And, it's entirely based on algorithms and what will sell millions of copies tomorrow.
Yep.
And it has really nothing to do with the quality of art or anything else.
And I would imagine that also puts a big limitation on how and where people can get started, even if they're really talented authors. Like, what's the pathway to publishing?
Yeah.
And I think that's part of it too, right?
Yeah, and currently there are 3 main ways that people publish.
Okay.
There's traditional large press, which is going to be, your Random House or Penguin or whatever. And those kinds of places won't even look at your manuscript unless you already have a very, very large social media following, which means that the people who end up getting published by them are either already famous because they got published back in the day before social media was a thing, or they're not necessarily artists so much as they are good networkers, if that makes sense.
Or they're already popular from another medium, and they just crank out a book even though they've never written anything before in their life.
Yeah. So that's large press. Traditional small press is easy to get into. The problem is that a lot of traditional small presses are kind of glorified scams, because they will say, "Oh yes, we would love to publish your book. Now send us $3,000." And so they don't actually care about your story. And a lot of times they don't even edit them.
And they probably don't even care whether or not you make money because
they
made
have
their $3,000.
Exactly. Yes. And then there's self-publishing, which in today's world is, through something like Amazon or Ingram Spark or one of these print-on-demand companies where you do all the work yourself, edit to whatever the best of your ability is, and people don't usually take those books seriously because, a 12-year-old can publish on Amazon or whatever.
Yes.
So it's the kind of thing that even if you do have a really good story, a library is not going to take your book unless you've proved otherwise, like, hey, look, I have this big following of people who read my books. And so then it goes back to the large press problem all over again. So basically, I was very, very frustrated. And so, as I said, I come up with crazy ideas.
Yeah.
I was like, how, hypothetically, could you make something that actually works? And so that kind of came down to what are the actual problems, and what are the deep flaws that each of these methods of publishing have, and how can you bypass that? And so that's where it eventually kind of bubbled in my mind of the idea, if you had a community-based publishing company where you don't take submissions at all, maybe for contests or something like that. But as far as general operations, you don't take submissions at all. People apply to join a council, which is essentially a glorified critique group. So you have 5 to 10 people who meet together regularly. They read each other's stuff. But once something's actually ready, it's been thoroughly polished, it's been thoroughly built up to reach its potential.
Yeah.
Then you can actually publish that. And one of the beauties with that method is that you can start to build a reputation. Obviously, it starts out slow, but you can start to build a reputation where every single book that this publisher produces, whatever its genre, whatever its age range, will actually be a high quality piece of art, because that love and attention and whatnot has been poured into it. And it's the same system that, say, Pixar uses for all of their movies. They have a council of people who really pick it apart, pick the movie apart in order for it to have, kind of that emotional oomph that those movies are so known for.
And I would imagine in this sort of a model, that one of the things I appreciate from that perspective is because when you have that if we go back to the large scale model, you submit your transcript, and there's somebody without a vested interest in you going over and pouring and making all of these changes who may not even be a writer. All they do is edit. Contrast that with what you're talking about here, where it's peer reviewed with people that have a creative idea, a creative lens, as well as an editing lens. I would think that it would lend itself to a much higher quality product in the end, because collectively, as a community, you have a vested interest in supporting each other and putting out the best work.
Yeah, definitely. And both while you are helping your fellow writers improve their work, and when you're working on your own, you're growing in your own skill as a writer. And so it's much different from if you're just, you're a well-known author working with a large press where, you kind of write your thing and they edit it for you. It's very much a give and take. And, everyone's ultimately building each other up in the process. And one of the beautiful things with this too is, it's okay if you have a new person come onto your council.
Yeah.
Because even if they're nowhere near ready to publish right now, through the process, they're going to get there.
Yeah.
And it's going to be, a positive experience for everyone all around. But yeah, I feel like I forgot to answer one of your questions, and now I'm trying to remember.
The other part it was like, so then you have the council, and then they do the peer review, and then what happens next?
Yeah, sure. So I remember what I was going to say now. Basically, what I was going to say with the ultimate beauty of the model, other than kind of what we already talked about with the growing as writers and all of that, is this way, no matter how big the company actually gets, you could still have that very human element. Because if you have all these councils of 5 to 10 writers, even if, I myself no longer know all of the writers individually, somebody does.
Yeah.
And so they have that support, even if we were to get hundreds or whatever of authors. So
even as it scales up, you still have that small organization feel, because you have a way it's constructed. That's very clever.
Yeah. And so then back to your question about what happens after a book is ready.
Yeah.
Is at that point, so let's say your council has determined, oh yes, this book is really good, it should get out there. Then the council can basically present it to the publishing company. And, so I guess you email me or whatever, right? And say, and again, if the group was to, if the publishing company continued to grow, I'm sure it would be more than just me, right? But you'd email whoever the board of whatever, and say, hey, I think that this book is ready to be published. Turn in the official request for publishing form. And at that point, then the press can either approve or deny that. And if it approves that, then great. It moves forward with the publishing process, at which point, it takes on all the various expenses involved in that, and does a final edit and all of that. If it denies publishing, then, it would send back a formal, notice of that, but then you'd be free to present that to whoever else. So, in that case, yes, if you're part of the council, you are, the press gets first rights of refusal, basically.
Okay.
But it's not, if they say no, it's not like your hands are tied.
Right. You still have the finished product, they just don't have them. Okay.
Yeah.
And then how many usually get printed if it's been selected?
Well, so currently, because the press is still very small, currently we're having to rely on print-on-demand companies, which I don't love because they're not very honest.
Yeah. They're kind of scammy.
Yeah. But right now, I still have a small enough press that I have to rely on other organizations like that.
Yeah.
Down the road, as we get bigger, then I would hope that we'd be able to actually do our own printing and all of that. But that's a a far off goal, I feel like, at this point. So,
like a 2-year plan kind of thing.
Well, it's probably farther off than 2 years.
That's fair. I'm hoping that you just grow like gangbusters. That's all I'm going to say.
Yeah. Well, and, it's the kind of thing, we've been around for a little more than 3 years at this point.
Yeah.
And so, in the moment, I get freaked out about this is scary. But when I actually zoom back, then I can see okay, we've actually come a really long way in 3 years.
Yeah.
And, we went from being just kind of an idea and, some online group, which, I mean, again, that was a little more than 3 years ago, but started out from just being some crazy idea. And, now we're an actual publisher with 5 books out currently and several more in the works.
That's awesome.
We currently have 2 fantasy novels and 3 illustrated children's fairy tales. So original fairy tales. And we've got several more of the fairy tales kind of down the pipe. We also have a new series that we're starting that those are illustrated children's stories that focus on just, the hard things of life, right?
Oh, interesting.
So
it's like a illustrated story with a moral, or not really moral, but like a conversation about important stuff.
Yeah. And so with both of these different children's story series that we're doing, we have different authors who are, they're basically a matching set, right?
Yeah.
And so, like with the fairy tale ones, which those I call household folk tales from Alonili and beyond, and those are original fairy tales that I'm picturing them as bedtime stories you'd read to the whole family, right? But the other series that is coming out soon, that I've tentatively called Tears of Sadness and Joy. And the first 3 books that are coming out, one of them is just kind of about more the simple bumps and bruises of life, right?
Yeah.
You have it from the perspective of a teddy bear who got basically the 2-year-old who owns him, threw a temper tantrum or whatever, and he got like a basically a torn stitch or something like that, and has to be stitched back together, right?
Yeah.
And then the other 2 are a little more heavy. We have one that is about like hospitalization and stuff. You have a kid who's just undergone a major surgery and kind of the slow recovery from that. And then the one of mine that's part of that same series deals with the topic of miscarriage, and how do you explain, basically like a tool for parents to kind of talk to their children about siblings who they've never gotten to meet. So,
and I appreciate stories like that, because you're not going to get that in mainstream media. You're not going to get that in mainstream books, and I would argue it's a very important conversation to know and have. So that's brilliant.
Yeah, and see, ever since having gone through miscarriage myself, I've talked to so many people, and it basically boiled down to I refused, like whenever people would ask me, like, oh, is this your first kid or whatever,
Yeah.
I would always say no, and you know, and so through that, I would end up having conversations with lots and lots of people and would get to hear their own stories because of this, and find out that so many people, they just don't know how to talk about it. And so, you'd have you'd have children who are possibly teenagers and still had no idea that they had,
Yeah, because there's a lot of shame attached to the language that the media uses when they have those conversations, and I don't. It's one of those things where we should be able to have frank conversations about without attaching judgment to those conversations. And what you see in media, what you see out there and all of other places is they attach judgment to that when they shouldn't.
And even if they're not doing that specifically,
yeah,
there's still just an awkwardness because nobody else knew that child.
Yeah.
So like when I miscarried, like 3 years ago, Um, that was a child who I was very close and bonded to.
Yeah.
But nobody else had ever met. And so, it's not like if you have a grandpa die or a parent die or, even a brother or a sister or whatever, other people knew that person. And so other people miss that person as well.
Yeah.
And whereas when you have a baby die, uh, that's other people don't feel that to a certain extent unless they themselves have known that kind of loss.
Yeah.
And so, they it's not even that they don't care so much as they just kind of forget because it's not real to them.
Yeah.
And
I could see that.
Yeah.
Yeah. It's not front of mind. And so they just kind of, well, yeah. Oh, that's fascinating. I really appreciate you bringing that up.
Thanks.
Yeah.
And, it is awkward. Like when I was pregnant with my now 1-year-old, that's when I would have all these kind of conversations,
Yeah.
right? Which doesn't mean that it never comes up now. It just, comes up less often now that people see me walking around with a little toddler, right?
Yeah.
But, when I was, pregnant with her and had just kind of made that decision that, no, I'm going to tell the truth, even if it's to some stranger in the grocery store who really doesn't actually care about my life story. Usually what I would say is, if they ask, oh, is this your first? Usually what I would say is, well, this is my rainbow baby. And people who knew what that meant knew what that meant. And, not everyone did, right? And so sometimes I would have to explain and,
Yeah.
a little bit less, I don't know, gentle of a way, like, what that meant. But, yeah, I found that far from making it a pity party about myself, I mean, it did help me heal because it helped, I wasn't just pretending that this other child didn't exist, but also it opened doors to talking to so many other people who, I would have people that I didn't even know, um, who would just like share their life story because it was like I was the first person who had actually had an honest conversation with them. And, that was crazy and something I definitely didn't expect or wasn't specifically planning on when I had made the decision to not hide that. So.
And I remember that a stepmom that I had also went through a miscarriage. And I remember back at the time, we weren't allowed to have conversations with it. We were just like, we didn't want to talk about it. And I think not talking about it and just letting it fester doesn't allow people to heal.
Yeah.
Like one of the and it kind of circle back to like your organization as well. If you're in a community and you have like people who have similar lived experiences, having those frank conversations with people with similar lived experiences opens doors to so much robust, wonderful, beautiful conversations that would not otherwise take place.
Yeah.
And I don't think people realize how common of an issue it is and how many people have had to deal with that.
Yeah.
And I would imagine, correct me if I'm wrong, there are times when you have these conversations where you're surprised by just how many people also have had that same experience.
Oh yeah. Yeah.
And so taking it back to the publisher piece of it, how do you determine like what type of books you want to publish?
Yeah, no, that's a good question. I mean, so there are times when people have asked me like, would you be interested in publishing X, Y, or Z? And it's like, let me think about that, you know,
Yeah.
because sometimes people, like I had one of my authors was asking about like poetry about pet loss or something like that. That, you know, something like that had never crossed my mind,
Yeah.
right? And
Yeah.
then I'm trying to think like, you know, is there a market for this? Is there not? You know, I don't know. I'm not, you know, but in the past, you know, in the past so far, because, you know, again, we're still very small, it's been often based on what people are working on, and then if at some point it's kind of like, yes, I think that this, you know, I think that this has a heart that's coming through or whatever,
Yeah.
then we can kind of move forward with that. But again, like right now, a lot of the projects that are in process are still, um you know, they're still works in progress, if that makes
It
sense.
does. Yeah.
um which is part of why we started doing the short story series is that, you know, we're working on. Is it's like, okay, we have a lot of authors who have good things coming down the pipe that aren't ready yet. You know, let's start kind of getting those authors out there now with something small and manageable. And then that way, when they do start, you know, when like their actual novels are ready, people have already read some of their short stories.
Almost like a teaser.
Kind of, yeah.
Yeah. Oh,
And
interesting.
also, like with the fairy tale series, most of the fairy tales are basically fairy tales that take place in the author's individual worlds.
Okay.
So it's also kind of like you've gotten a little taste of their world before their actual book comes out.
So when you're developing a story and you're thinking about like the world versus character, do you start with the world and then develop a character, or do you start with the character and then develop the
That
world?
totally depends on the writer.
That's fair.
Yeah. Like with me, I would even that I can't say as a blanket statement. I would say usually um usually I come up with the characters first, I would say. But that's definitely not how everyone is. Like I have a sister who's extremely good at coming up with worlds. Like she comes up with extremely complex worlds.
Oh, nice.
And you know, um for her it's more like coming up with plots and actually writing the books that's hard, you know.
Right.
But she can envision these very very like um these very very interesting and very distinct worlds. um for me, I've had to, you know, I think when I started something like Gap in the Road, it started out in kind of just your generic fake medieval kind of fantasy
Yeah.
world, right? And you know, I rewrote it over 12 years, um, but you know, it's still the kind of thing that I've had to learn quite a lot about world building since then, right? And so, really having to think about what are the, um, you know, what are the things that make this world unique, and really having to dig, like, because when you're world building, for instance, you have to think about things like, um, I don't, you know, things that you deal with in actual real life. You know,
Yeah.
any person interacts with, let's say, the economy that they live in, or the, you know, the political sphere that they live in, the, you know, the world views, the you know, just what kinds of jobs exist. You know,
Yeah.
what do people wear, what do people like, you know, what is school, you know, all these kinds of questions that you really have to think about, like in.
Even like, what's the climate?
Sure. Yeah, absolutely. What
Yeah.
kind of animals live around there? There's so much that goes into world building. And, you know, the more um you know, the more in depth you as the author know, the more that the reader will feel like this is a real world that they're being immersed into, um, rather than just some, you know, fake medieval
Yeah.
uh, you know, generic kind of world. and you can always kind of tell when you're reading fantasy whether you had an author who like really put in that effort or not. So
who inspires you as writers?
sure, yeah. Well, I mean, there are several writers that I would, I don't know, I guess that inspire me in different ways. On the topic of, I mean, I'm of course a Tolkien nerd. I mean, that's just get the obvious one out there first. But as far as something like world building goes, I'd say someone like Brandon Sanderson or Stephen Lawhead are both examples of just very, very rich and real feeling world building. I'm also inspired by Andrew Peterson because he's the one that wrote the book that ruined me and made me start Alonili in the first place.
Okay.
And he also writes fantasy too. That's very fun. But I'm trying to think who else. I mean, I was inspired to a certain degree by John Flanagan, who wrote the Ranger's Apprentice series, because that's a very fun, like kind of middle grade fantasy. But one thing that I do really enjoy about those is one, you can tell he does put in the research to know, like, oh, how did, say, people actually do these things in medieval times,
Yeah.
So, in that sense, he's not just talking out of his butt when he's talking about archery or, I don't know, tracking or whatever else. But also, those books kind of give me, they give me kind of a good, what was I going to say? Like, metric, I guess.
Okay, yeah.
Because since my series that I'm working on right now, I don't look at it specifically as being young adult, but at the same time I want it to be approachable, let's say, for middle school and up, right?
Yeah.
And so I can use those books kind of as a metric for, okay, am I getting are things at least as am I getting more gruesome, say, than Ranger's Apprentice? If I'm not, I'm good.
I gotcha.
Because he does. The reality is, you have a world, and bad stuff's going to happen in said world, and you're going to have people who do, people who are cruel, or people who exhibit various forms of oppression or whatever else, And how do you talk about these things in a way that still shows the wrongness of it, without, let's say, making it just too dark for an older kid. So
well, we've been at it for about an hour.
Okay.
How do people get a hold of you and your books?
Sure. Well, there's always my website, which is alonilipress.com. That's ALONILI press.
And I'll put that in the chat as well.
Okay. We have Facebook, we have Instagram. The books that we have out are all available on Amazon and various other places in the online world.
You got it. And what's the name of your book?
My book is Gap in the Road. So by Katherine Munson, that's me. And we also have the other fantasy book that we have out that I didn't write, is Tendrils of Nahazman by Rebecca Niffen. And then we have
That's a cool name.
Yeah. And that book is more of, if you were to take, well, it's not technically teenage romance because she's like a 98-year-old fae or something.
Okay.
But,
right.
She has about the maturity of a teenager.
Okay.
With way too much power and trying to fight evil spirits and things like that. Anyway, so, but then you have, and then we have, the three short stories out so far, where there's The Crown and the Staff, which I wrote. There is The Folly of Rico II, which is written by John P. Crocker III. And then Toil and Dreams, which is a children's fable, more kind of in the Aesop's fable type of feel, by Jenna Bilby. So, yeah.
Perfect. And Katie, thank you so much. And you got to check it out. This is awesome.